I have on my shelves a book called Die Geschichte der Dummheit, which means, as you'll all see, the history of stupidity. And I think a good question for Dominic in his finals here in this room in 1978 would have been, um, what is the role of stupidity in modern history? Illustrate with a few examples. Because actually stupidity is a much underrated factor in history. And the most dangerous kind of stupidity is the stupidity of highly educated and intelligent people, even, dare I say, Oxford-educated people. And this it is which in good measure gave us Brexit. Very important. This is not in any way some kind of metropolitan Oxonian elite condescension to the people who voted for Brexit, many of whom had very genuine discontents and honourable motives. It is about Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, e tutti quanti, who advanced very articulately these apparently sophisticated arguments, all of which were completely without foundation. And we can see now, as we come up to the 10th anniversary of Brexit, what an act of monumental folly it was. By the way, across the continent of Europe, our friends saw it immediately. Most of our friends in North America and Canada saw it immediately. It was only the Brits who took a little longer to see it, but they too are seeing it. At the last YouGov poll, the question was, Brexit more of a failure or more of a success? 62% said more of a failure, just 11% more of a success. Now, I myself was a passionate supporter of the second referendum, the people's vote. I then had a period, and I know Mike and I talked about this over lunch a couple of years ago, when I thought this is not the moment to say, let's go straight for rejoin. I thought this was a moment to say, let's get as close to Europe as we can in the current circumstances. I now feel in these circumstances, approaching the 10-year mark, this is the moment. This is the moment to start saying we need to rejoin the EU. But as you rightly say in the annual report, and by the way, I think the 23rd of June 2026 would be a perfect moment to say that loud and clear across the country. But as you rightly say in your report, it is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And what is more, it's going to be a marathon mainly running uphill. So Mike, a moment ago, laying out this vision, you said approaching the shining castle on a hill. That adaptation of the familiar metaphor, shining city on a hill, is absolutely right. Number one, it's a very tall and steep hill. Number two, it's a castle, not a city. A city is open, you just drive in. Getting back into the EU is not going to be easy. The EU is brilliant at aggregating the special interests of all its member states, and then some. Everybody knows who's negotiated to join the EU, how tough and actually unfair it is. We will never again get the favorable terms that we had as members. So it's a castle, and alas, it's no longer shining so brightly. Hence my title. And Dominic already alluded to this, Europe's crisis. But in that crisis, there is an opportunity. So what I'm going to do, looking at the clock, knowing that we have limited time, we have to be out here at 4 o'clock. I want to leave some time for Q&A. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the crisis, and then I'm going to talk about the opportunity and how we can and should seize it. So most of us in this room have lived through two periods of European history, the post-war period since 1945 and what I call the post-wall period, the period that runs from the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 to the 24th of February 2022, when Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine ends at one stroke both the post-war and the post-war period. If you want to know more about that, read Homeland's, copies of it you've heard available at the back of the hall. The new period is marked by a full-scale interstate land war, which has already cost more than 1 million killed and wounded, Russian and Ukrainian combined, and shows no sign of ending, sadly. That alone justifies the claim that it's a new period. But it's also characterized by Europe facing 3 big external shocks and a number of big internal challenges. The 3 big external shocks, I'll call them in shorthand: Putin shock, Xi shock, Trump shock. Each of the individuals I've mentioned, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump, are very important in this story. Individuals matter in history. We've talked a lot about Winston Churchill. Our own history would have been completely different without Winston Churchill in 1940 and subsequently. But behind each of these shocks is a much larger story. In the case of the Putin shock, it is a Russia which is revanchist, authoritarian, neo-imperialist, and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Behind the Xi shock is not just a Chinese superpower, which is entirely happy to treat Russia as perhaps its closest partner in the world today, but also an India, a Turkey, a Brazil, a South Africa, all these non-Western great and middle powers, which are all also quite happy to go on treating Russia as a necessary partner or ally, even though Russia is waging a neo-colonial war in Ukraine. And what is more, for the first time in modern history, these non-Western great and middle powers have between them sufficient wealth and power to counterbalance the West, right? So we in the West threw the kitchen sink at Ukraine with sanctions after the full-scale invasion. I know there were holes in it, but it was a major package of sanctions. Russian economy has done better than ours in the last 3 years. Why? Partly because they'd prepared for it, but partly because they had China and India and Turkey and Brazil and South Africa, all of whom were happy to go on buying the oil and doing the trade with them that we were not. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, last year had a combined economy which at purchasing power parity, $10 trillion larger than that of the G7, right? So they can counterbalance us. That is new. In a sense, we're now already in a post-Western world. Now, a year and a week ago, to be accurate, a year and a week ago, I would have said, okay, when I say we're in a post-Western world, I don't mean that the West no longer exists, because the traditional West, in the creation of which Churchill was so important, the transatlantic West, still existed. With Donald Trump, I think we can no longer say that. Today, I don't think the geopolitical West exists as a political actor. And as I think it was Dominic rightly mentioned, it's not just Trump. It's a long-term secular trend with the United States. So we can no longer rely on the United States, especially under Trump, but Trump or no Trump, for the support of Ukraine and to be the backstop of our security. So we face these triple external shocks on top of the existing ones of climate change and immigration and inequality and AI and so on. And we face them in a Europe which, on top of the challenges of demography and debt and generational divide, has a major internal political battle underway. I would call it the Battle of Two Europes, both at the European level and in our national politics. we have essentially a battle between two Europes. One, our own liberal, internationalist, open, pro-European, and another explicitly anti-liberal, Eurosceptic, if not hostile to Europe, nationalist and populist. Of course, that's a simplification. Of course, there are multiple variations of these stories. But essentially, in any European country that you look at, and in the politics of the European Parliament, by the way, the background to that very interesting detail about the EU withdrawing support for EMI is the shifting balance also in the European Parliament. You see this great divide. The structural problem we have in the European Union, in Europe as a whole, is that the policies we need are European, but the politics are still mainly national, right? So we need a defense policy at European scale, a digital policy at European scale, an AI policy, a capital market at European scale, EU plus, not always just EU, but nonetheless at European scale. But the politics are still mainly national. So anyone who's been in Brussels knows that everything is about what's the next big national election coming up. Or in the case of Germany, even the big regional election coming up. How's that going to block it? Now, if you look at these national politics, we have a real problem because those two forces I talked about are very evenly balanced. One wins one election in Romania, but narrowly. Another wins an election, but narrowly in Poland. Hooray, we say in the Netherlands, Rob Yetten, the Liberals have won. Yeah, but the populists were still very strong, and so it goes on. And I would say that Hungary inside the EU is more of a problem for the EU even than Britain outside it. A little factoid for you. Last year, in the Council of the European Union, which is the intergovernmental part of it, Hungary voted no nearly 16% of the votes. That is more than Britain voted no before Brexit. And they're inside. And he's a veto player. And his vote is needed on every round of sanctions on Ukraine. So inside the European Union, you have, so to speak, the populist fifth column. And what we see is in our national politics is both polarization and fragmentation simultaneously, right? So they're both polarized, but also fragmented into more and more parties. By the way, irony of ironies, the most anti-European politician in Britain, Nigel Farage, has been a catalyst of the Europeanization of our politics. Never before in this country, since did we have such an anti-liberal nationalist populist party having such a big share of the vote, at least in public opinion polls. That's a continental European phenomenon. And we are getting a fragmentation of our politics, right? Now we've got 4, 5, 6 parties being involved, Lib Dems, Greens, SNP, Plaid, and so on. What does that look like? That looks exactly like the political landscape in most continental European countries. So irony of ironies, Nigel Farage is a motor of the Europeanization of our politics. In terms of what's going to happen with the EU, there's going to be a whole series of major elections coming up in the next 2, 3, 4 years, and they are going to decide which way it goes, where the majority is, where the weight is. Hungary, April next year, hopeful. For the first time since Viktor Orban took over in 2010, he's behind in the opinion polls. So I'll be there on April the 20th because I really want to see Viktor Orban fall. Denmark also coming up next year. That'll be a very interesting one. And then 2027, bumper year French presidential, Polish parliamentary, probably Italian and Spanish as well. I'm afraid there is a very good chance that at least one of those big elections is going to go, from our point of view, the wrong way. And if it's the French presidential, which seems quite likely, and Jordan Bardella becomes the next president of France, that's going to be a very big problem. Of course, Germany is crucial to this whole story. I'd be happy to talk about that in Q&A if we have time, because I want now to come to Britain and the EU and how we seize the opportunity of this crisis, which is too big to waste. But of course, we have a government which is at the moment precisely wasting it. Some of you may remember that wonderful July last year, when just a fortnight after the election, the so-called European political community, all the countries of Europe, met at Blenheim Palace, which of course commemorates a European battle fought by the Duke of Marlborough to defend the Holy Roman Empire, because that's actually what the battle was about. And he was rewarded with, I think, a countship of the Holy Roman Empire. And at that time, both sides, continental European and British, thought, here's a great opportunity. Unfortunately, our government, in the course of missing that opportunity, the reset, you said something rather polite about it in your annual report, but in my view, the reset is precisely failing to seize this chance. The reset has been impressive in supporting Ukraine, in defense, in security policy, in diplomacy. When Keir Starmer goes to Washington to talk to Trump, he goes as a European leader. That's all great. But that's all stuff where Britain is contributing, is adding to, is giving value added to what the European Union can do. Where we are being unbelievably timid is in relations directly with the EU when it comes to economic or social or human issues like freedom of movement. And we all know the reason, because it's sitting there in number 10 is blue Labour, terrified of breaking the red lines because it might lose the red wall seats, right? Blue afraid of red. But in this situation, we are, in a sense, allowing, and this was alluded to already, the Brussels institutions, the EU themselves, not to be put on the spot, right? And not to confront the larger political challenge of a more ambitious proposal for a reset. So as you know, and again, I think Dominic alluded to this, at the moment, in these negotiations, the EU is being extremely hardline, right? Extremely tough. And for example, outrageously, demanding an upfront payment of 6.5 billion euros to be allowed just to bid for contracts in a total package for the European defense industry worth only 150 billion euros. That's a pretty outrageous demand. And on almost all the other dossiers, they're being quite hardline. Why? Firstly, because this is still being handled by senior and mid-level officials in Brussels, for whom, believe it or not, Brexit was one of the EU's greatest successes in the last 10 years. Because from the point of view of a functionary in Brussels, Brexit was a success because the EU 27 magnificently kept their unity, kept a common position, and Brussels struck a brilliant bargain for the EU and a very bad bargain for Britain. So they're, in a sense, continuing along that line, strongly encouraged by a number of member state ambassadors, notably the French, in Brussels, who hide behind the institutions of the EU to make these positions. Now, how do you change that? I'll tell you how you change that. This is a lesson from the whole history of the EU. You change it by getting the big boys and girls involved. Once you get the heads of government involved, Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, Giorgia Meloni, Donald Tusk, and others who say this is actually a political priority because the United Kingdom is offering us a more ambitious reset, those officials have to do what they're told. And even those ambassadors have to shut up. But unless and until you do that, we're going to be in this extremely difficult position because neither side is really putting their weight behind making progress in the UK-EU relationship. And here's the problem. The window is closing. The window is closing, not just because it's already been 16 months and people are getting pretty fed up, but because come 2027, we'll have that slew of European elections. And if just one or two of them go the wrong way, if you have a President Bardella and a peace government in law and justice government in Poland, you're not going to have, so to speak, the strategic majority among European leaders to make this happen. So perhaps we need a new prime minister. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But certainly we need a new and more ambitious initiative for a reset, and we need it soon because this window of opportunity is not going to be open all that much longer. It's going to be an uphill marathon. We have to start it now. I'll be with you reimagining it on the 23rd of June, 2026 next year. I hope you can invite the new Hungarian Prime Minister, who I hope will not be called Viktor Orban. And I hope you can invite the current Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who'd be a great person to have there. I have a couple of thoughts about who else should be there, but I'll leave that open and give time for questions. Let me just say two final things before throwing this open. First of all, I don't know about you, but I always think that we have what I might call the British Europeans dilemma. In a sense, if we want to get to rejoin, the differential between how Britain is doing and how the EU is doing has to be quite large, right? Because that's, in a sense, how we came to join in the first place, because there was a clearly visible differential. But we cannot want our own country to do really badly, to be in a mess. And so my formula is we must want Britain to do really well and the EU to do even better. Final word. One of the greatest Europeans of recent times was Václav Havel, the Czech president, playwright, former dissident. And he has a famous passage where he says, talks about optimism. And he says, optimism is not prognostication. It is not the belief that things are going to turn out well. It is the belief that there are things that are worth fighting for, whether or not they, in the end, they turn out that way. And it's in that spirit of optimism that I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we should be starting the uphill marathon for Britain to rejoin the European Union sometime between 2030 and 2035, by which time I hope Ukraine will also be a member. Thank you very much.